Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if Gran Colombia never collapsed. Gran Colombia was a short-lived country that declared independence 1819 and existed roughly until 1831. Gran Colombia had countries within them like Colombia, Panama, Venezuela and Ecuador. Its territories, however, should officially be the ones of the former Viceroyalty of New Granada, and if you wanna check how big it was, you can of course always Google it. That's why it's also claiming, or it used to claim, parts of Nicaragua, which is called the Mosquito Coast, which for some time was under English or British control. Two key people were Simon Bolivar and Francisco de Paula Santander, who were at odds with each other because they had very different ideas. The problem of Gran Colombia was that first of all there was a fight or discussion about a stronger presidency which would be led and was supported by President Simon Bolivar, making it effectively a dictatorship or having a decentralized federal form of government around the Constitution of Cucuta, which were favored by Francisco de Paula Santander and his followers. Gran Colombia inherited the caste system of Spain, which created just further problems, as we all know, and it's again one of this topic that comes up again and again in all my videos that are treating this part of the world. And well, these problems, they were not addressed even with the formation of Gran Colombia. And only the most influential people of that time, they could actually participate in this project of Gran Colombia, because before it never really existed under this form. And yes, it was a project. And thus the majority of people, they were left out. The geography was also very complicated. I mean, just look in the maps. The geography of this place would be very complicated in the sense of having many mountains. I mean, you have the mountains going up from the coast where you have the Caribbean. It goes then down to the Andes, you have the jungles, you have oceans all around, and yes, you also have the lack of infrastructure, because again, the Spanish, they were not so known to build a lot of infrastructure in their colonies. Any stable Gran Colombia would need to build, especially need to build a lot of infrastructure as soon as possible in order to connect the different parts that they wanted to get independence in our timeline. Moreover, the problem with Gran Colombia was also that Simon Bolivar wanted to export his version of the revolution, and you know how it is that when you want to export everything and just go out, well, your home becomes very problematic, and this is what happened in our timeline as well. And so instead of just supporting the revolution by sending some money or soldiers or even goods, well, he just went in Peru to Bolivia personally, and thus he left the power vacuum in Gran Colombia. After some more years and the project of Gran Colombia fell apart, and many supporters of Simon Bolivar, they were frustrated. Many wars between the independent states happened. You had many more civil wars. I mean, there were only a few years in the history of Colombia itself where they actually didn't have civil wars. So what if all of that changed? What if Gran Colombia never collapsed? One point of divergence I propose is that Simon Bolivar would not just go and campaign around other countries of South America for his version of the revolution. Peru and Bolivia would anyways get independent because Spain was having a very bad time, and they would not just be able to take back their former possessions in South America. Having Simon Bolivar in Peru or Colombia wouldn't change that fact, that Spain would anyways lose colonial possessions. The following year, Simon Bolivar could do a few things. he could potentially strengthen his position and his point of views without any opposition. He could try to do that with a bit of opposition, or he would come to an agreement with Francisco de Paula Santander. I personally believe that smaller conflicts, they would be possible, and that nobody would just give up their point of view because, well, especially in revolutionary times, this is just nothing that happens like that. Either Francisco de Paula Santander gets murdered, is exiled, or he would wage a civil war and get killed by supporters of Simon Bolivar. Gran Colombia would not cease to exist, but rather Simon Bolivar would militarily unite all parts of Gran Colombia and go to the direction of a dictatorship, while also giving concessions to certain regions, especially Venezuela. Why Venezuela, you may ask? Well, most supporters of Bolivar, they were from Venezuela, and in OTL, Bolivar's supporters of Venezuela, they became disillusioned with Bolivar's decisions, and they just couldn't identify with his ideas anymore, his belief system. However, in this timeline, since Bolivar stays in Gran Colombia, he gets more powerful and is also much closer to his supporter base, and maybe more often in touch with them, and thinks they would get a little bit better. Bolivar would also be able to build up his power and provide stability in Gran Colombia. Him not going and helping Peru and Bolivia will change one thing in particular: Bolivia. Bolivia as a country will surely exist, but under a very different name. I can't really predict which alternate name Bolivia would have, but it's very sure that, yeah, this alternate version of Bolivia would still exist. Also, the Battle of Ayacucho could change a bit, but I think that anyways the bigger picture will not change at all, which means that all the South American possessions of Spain, they will be lost. Gran Colombia's stabilization would mean one thing: that Britain may be interested in having it as an ally. Britain wanted to secure Guyana and its Caribbean possessions, and having an ally like Gran Colombia would help them control better these areas, while Gran Colombia would have a very important and strong ally just in case, first of all, Spain would try to do anything silly or shady, or if other countries around it would try to invade it, for instance. And in there, perhaps the idea of an hostile US could also already exist in this early time, and thus Britain as an ally would be very vital for this young state. After Bolivar's death, it is very likely that some power struggle will exist, and that Gran Colombia would need to have a lot of time to actually become a regional power, at least, that could influence maybe its smaller surroundings and minor neighbors around it. But Ecuador, Venezuela, later on, they will not really get independence because, yeah, with all these years where Bolivar, he ruled over Gran Colombia, the elite, at least, of these regions, they would have a feeling of common belonging, and thus they would not flirt around with the ideas of getting independence. A few more years would pass, and the idea of a Panama Canal would be discussed by many powers. The French would still try to build the Panama Canal first, and it would still lead to the same result, while the US would try to support an independent Panama in order to acquire the territories around the canal and also have some type of puppet state in there. With Gran Colombia in the picture, not only would this not happen at all, but it would also add fuel to the already worsening situation and reputation of the US in Latin America. Many countries would have had it enough with their interference, and the Gran Colombians would be able to repel the US from its territories. The canal would either be finished by the French or be built by Gran Colombia themselves with British support. Now you may ask, how could Gran Colombia repel the US? Well, if you are looking at the geography again, and also what is existing around Panama and in there, I mean, especially nowadays when you consider the border between Panama and Colombia, the jungle is not really your friend, and since the US, they would have no experience whatsoever to fight in the jungle, I can imagine that either it will cost them a lot, or it could already become like an earlier version of a Vietnam War, or they would just recognize that there is no use about it, and they may even be afraid that other powers could be triggered to intervene and having then more conflicts around. Well, Britain, for instance, they could intervene if they would like to. During World War I, a few changes they could happen. Gran Colombia, being dependent on exporting raw materials to many countries, would probably agree to have some type of an alliance with Mexico, and depending on how the British elite and the British government would stand with the US in such a war, I believe that Gran Colombia could start to become very disillusioned with Britain, one of their earliest and only allies. So instead we could see that there would be a shift also within Gran Colombia and how they would feel about being a country. They would rather prefer to become an ally of Germany because, first of all, not only the Germans would then be at a war with the US, but also because they would already send a telegram to the Mexicans, and having also a power like Gran Colombia in there would be very interesting. And the two countries, they may actually declare war to the US or even attack it or support each other in some way or another. Of course, it would end in a disaster for the Mexicans, while Gran Colombia again may only lose some parts of their territory and parts also like of the Panama Canal or the parts of Guyana, and also the claims that it has to it. But this would again anger future generations of Gran Colombians. The US would now really have problems in keeping control in Latin America, as they like to call it, also in their backyards. And also the outcome of World War I would be a little bit different. The war would end a bit later, but every country would still pay a huge price, including also the US in this scenario. Before and during World War II, Gran Colombia, Mexico and many other Latin countries would see fascism actually as a very appealing ideology that they would need to adopt in order to counter the US influence. The US was a very liberal and a very strong proponent of democracy, so the opposite of this democratic and liberal ideology in the 30s or the end 20s would be fascism instead of communism, because communism was not so internationally known as fascism could be in such a scenario, with having powerful countries like Germany and Italy, for instance, succumbing to fascism, and in some ways also Spain, but that's another discussion. Gran Colombia would invent its own type of fascism, have an own type of narrative where the liberation of Panama and Guyana would be seen as vital, important. It would be some type of heart of Gran Colombia, let's say, where nowadays you have, for instance, other parts that are called the heart of X country, especially when they are having a war, like in the Caucasus, for instance. Bolivar, he would also be reinterpreted, and there would be also this fight and this split among Latin America and Anglo-America, or even more importantly, Anglophone countries would be the enemies, and Germany as well as Italy and then later on Japan, they would be seen as countries that not only fight colonialism, imperialism, but also this Anglophone dominance. The war would take a bit longer than in OTL once more, but still end up in a defeat of fascism. It is possible that Gran Colombia may not totally be defeated once more and even keep some of its territories or get the canal back after X years, because I imagine that in such a war they would not be seen as a priority target, and there is also not this chance that the Americans would use a nuclear bomb in Gran Colombia, because, well, they were not as powerful as the Japanese, and they were also kind of close to the US, so they also probably didn't want to have an atomic bomb used on the American continent, because that would also give problems with their idea of the Monroe Doctrine. The same thing happened between China and Britain, for instance, where after X years Britain gave Hong Kong back, so perhaps something like this could happen between the US and Gran Colombia, where the Panama Canal would be given back to them. While fascism would be totally eradicated, not only from Europe but also from Latin America, in Latin America the elite and also the former supporters of fascism, they could try to flirt with other ideologies like socialism and communism, because it would be seen as a very anti-American ideology, and it's exactly what the Soviets, they were trying to propose to the world, an anti-American ideology, and they would pick up to it. So we would not only see perhaps Cuba becoming communist, but we would also have a very, at least Soviet-friendly regime in Gran Colombia, and perhaps it even becomes the most friendly Soviet regime in all of the Americas. And having Gran Colombia in there also means that the Soviets have again other possibilities to reach other places where they can also yet more support counter movements to the US dominance, as they would see it in their own ideology. The Cold War gets much more intense, because if you not only have like Cuba in there, who is communist, you also have now Gran Colombia, who is decisively pro-Soviet, and then you will not only have a Cuban Missile Crisis, if it happens at all, but there might be another more important crisis. And actually, I believe that with some confidence, and also with the backing of the Soviets, and having also more allies around like Cuba, and perhaps even in some way China and other Latin American countries, we could see that Gran Colombia would try to give up perhaps to this treaty that they had with the US, and they would try to get the Panama Canal back even by force, which would trigger a very big problem. The US, they needed the Panama Canal to have some support within their economy. They also needed it to transport bigger quantities of goods from one place to another, from the west coast to the east coast and the east coast to the west coast. And if you cut down the Panama Canal from this equation, the US will have heavy losses in their economy, and I believe that this will mean that, the Cold War will turn hot, very hot. While Gran Colombia would not become a big power, it would become a very important player, and a key player as well, and key ally, especially for the Soviets, and have an influence that is very unpredictable in history. In OGL, only Brazil or Argentina could become a potential Latin American power, but with Gran Colombia in the picture, we would have a country who would be at odds with the US, and who could even defend itself thanks to the geography. The Panama Canal, which was very important to the US, could, with a strong communist and Soviet influence, even become the trigger of a possible hot conflict. And who knows, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closure for US ships in the Panama Canal may become the reason for the Cold War turning hot. And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.